Welcome back to a special extended edition of the Luminary Room. I'm Nico, the voice behind 369 Lumineer, and this is episode 29, The Shadow System. Joining me again is Jen V, a writer and full-time researcher whose work spans metaphysics, ancient history, consciousness, and areas that I believe sit well outside mainstream narratives. Jen is also a former registered nurse and an NDE survivor. But what stands out for me in Jen's work is her commitment to archival research, digging into what's documented but rarely ever discussed. So, Jen, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
Good to have you. Before we dive into the deep end, and I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion, when we use a term like, the military-industrial complex, as we've used before in our Ice Wall podcast, what are we actually talking about in practical terms? And it's more so for our audience's edification.
The military-industrial complex, to just sum it up for the purposes of where we're going and where we came from with Antarctica, part 1 and 2, I think it's just easier to say that the military-industrial complex encompasses all of the weapons, the secrecy, the black budget programs, which we will be discussing.
Sure.
And the intelligence agencies is part of that. All of the intelligence agencies that we know of and that we don't.
If I can add my bit, and this is my understanding, and let me know what your thoughts are. For me, it's the relationship between the government, the military, and private industry that produce, I guess, and fund defence and security. Would you agree that that encompasses everything?
I think that's a better explanation. I would just say that it's in what we're about to discuss, it's not just defensive.
Right.
It's actually offensive. And I think the point about it being private industry intersecting with that is very important. So thank you for including that. I really do appreciate that.
Thank you, Jen. Now, you did mention in your definition the word black budget. So I know a lot of people may or may not have heard that. I would hazard a guess and suggest that people haven't, the masses haven't really heard what black budget means. So in your experience and your expertise in your research, what does that actually mean in practice?
They're not called officially black budget. They're referred to that way from the perspective of civilians. It's called special access programs, or SAPs.
Right.
And the CIA Act of 1949 allowed spending without regard to the provisions of law for confidential activities. So right from the beginning, before we even get started, there's worked in, well, we can tell you, except for confidential activities,
Yeah.
Similar to the Antarctic Treaty. Who enforces it? Nobody. Everybody enforces it themselves. So right from the jump in 1949, they already wrote in spending except for regard to confidential activities. So that encompasses much of what we're going to discuss.
Would you say it's essentially government funding streams that sit outside public scrutiny, let's say?
Yes.
Right.
It's these programs, special access programs, whose existence is denied even to most congressional committees, with oversight limited to a small group of cleared people. There might be a couple on the Senate Intelligence Committee. What happens is they keep shifting. It could be naval intelligence, then it goes to the Senate intelligence. Everything is meant to confuse everybody, but it's largely outside. It's denied and outside of the purview of the public or so-called public servants, aka politicians.
Of course. And we're going to be focusing on, and please, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but when we talk about the military-industrial complex and black budgets, we're going to be focusing on US specifically because that's where a lot of our information comes from. Is that your understanding?
I think that's fair to say because they're in the archives here, and I can tell you from the perspective of America some key points.
Okay.
But these operations go worldwide.
Of course they do. So who's supposed to oversee these programs, and where does that oversight tend to sort of fizzle out?
Okay, technically, it's supposed to be supervised by the CIA. And in theory, these other groups I mentioned in the budget committees, the Senate committees, but that doesn't really happen. The CIA is the one that gives the operational orders and is often responsible for selecting people for studies, getting the materials that would be required to carry out these missions. And I think there's an intersection of actual military that may be needed to help execute stated goals of a particular mission.
Okay. So, structure obviously, heavy structure obviously exists. And we spoke about this in our Antarctica podcast where, I think we mentioned Area 51 and the secrecy that it's departmentalized, let's put it that way, right? So from your research, and this is where we're going to dive into the weeds as you refer them to, is this secrecy primarily around protection of, let's say, US citizens or citizens in general, or is it more about control?
Short answer is control. And it's not to protect the citizens, it's to protect the people carrying out these experiments and then operational missions, as we'll uncover. I think it's more for their protection, but the larger aspect is power because they can do this to people without consent.
Would you say that there are legitimate security needs that are required as a result of these programs?
Depending on the project, I think that from someone who is a civilian and not in the military, I would imagine with interrogation for actual captured prisoners and things like that, I'm sure there's a reason. There's just a whole lot of other things that are included in these projects that seem nefarious and we can see playing out today. But there are, I'm positive, missions that require security for defense. Again, we're going to delineate from offense.
Great. And they clearly operate without any accountability from, obviously, the research that both you and I have been exposed to. Can I ask you, do you have an example where something classified was later exposed?
Yes. There was a case. Okay, first we're going to start. Can we start with Project Artichoke using drugs?
Okay.
All right. So a bunch of prisoners this is different than the case you're going to mention. It was in Alabama that were hurt by drugs and tortured using psychological techniques. I found in the archives that was 1974, but there's not a lot of information. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act requested and uncovered 20,000 surviving documents, mostly financial records, and they were all misfiled in either a storage building or sent to different divisions like the Department of Energy to keep the records so that it would be hard to keep up. But as a result of these documents in 1977, here in America, there was what was called the Church Committee, and it was a Senate Select Committee and Rockefeller Commission.
Surprise.
And that revealed MK Ultra's existence after investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. And that's when a lot of things came spilling out. They didn't delineate the names of projects because you will see later that they're all amorphous. They fly in and out of different projects to keep things hard to find. But 1977, the Church Committee did get for the first time what had been denials. This program started in 1950 officially. And by 74, there was a lawsuit, and each claimant, 4 prisoners, were given $750,000. 3 years later, we have the Church Commission, Frank Church, and it is admitted. Also, there was a case in the 50s of Frank Olson. He was a part of architecture, engineering, and other functions inside the military. And he was in New York and was unwittingly given LSD by a Dr. Gottlieb that runs all of these psychological operations. And he wound up, he didn't know he was on LSD. He was given it and wound up crashing through the story of a hotel, however many stores up to its death. That family sued in 1983 and was compensated by the government. So it was, an again, acknowledgement that these experiments did take place and caused real harm. And also in 1981 to 83, it was revealed that doctors were going to Canada and they were doing projects in Toronto and Montreal that were using mechanisms that will be used in these programs that we're going to discuss. So and that was on the mainstream. So these people unwittingly checked into psychiatric facilities for things like postpartum depression and wound up without consent, being often drugged, put into comas, and several different techniques, which we can discuss, were used to experiment to see if it would wipe their mind, if they could create memories that could be accessed, erase memories. They were really playing with the brain, but it did break out into the mainstream. But the masses kind of forgot about it, and let's move on with the next cycle.
Nothing to see here, folks. And sometimes it does take decades for any of this information to come out. And you just mentioned something that reminds me of a lot of the videos that I've seen about DMT and how, they use DMT, not just LSD obviously in the 50s and 60s. But you mentioned the 50s and 60s, and I think this is where we start to make a bit of pace here. Around that time, it was what we now refer to as the Cold War, leading up to obviously the Reagan era. But how much of this originates in Cold War thinking? So back after the Second World War, how much of the secrecy, the paranoia, let's call it, emanated post-Cold War?
Okay. Easy. As I told you, in 1949, the CIA already laid the groundwork for secrecy. Between 1950 and 51, there was a project called Project BLUEBIRD. And in 1952, it was changed to Project ARTICHOKE. It's crucial to remember that name because that has never stopped and we have lived through it globally.
That's Artichoke. Yeah, okay. Yep.
Now, in 1953, they changed or added MK Ultra. And Ultra in this context means ultra secret. Like there's a level of secrecy for classified, but MK Ultra documents are ultra classified. So in 1952 came Project Artichoke. And if I may, can I just state the stated goals?
Of course, yes, absolutely.
This will make perfect sense.
This is the deep stuff that we like.
Yes. Okay. Project Artichoke posed the question, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation? That is the official stated goal. And I want to give you a quick tweet that will provide or demonstrate what it looks like when someone is under this control.
Sure.
May I?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. This was a doctor who tweeted and will demonstrate by the tweet how they will do something even against their own self-preservation. She writes, I will never regret the vaccine, even if it turns out I injected actual poison and have only days to live. My heart is and was in the right place. I got vaccinated out of love, while anti-vaxxers did everything out of hate. If I have to die because of my love for the world, then so be it. But I will never regret or apologize it.
Wow.
This is from a medical doctor, MD.
Wow.
So that is saying, even if she knows it's poison, she loves her country enough that she just will do it anyway.
Wow. So
and that perfectly, I think, illustrates what the stated objective for Project Artichoke is.
That's a great example. That actually scares me listening to that
And
because,
she posted that in 2023. So this
wow.
is that recent.
And I know we're going to go through a few other examples as we dive deeper into this discussion, but that, we saw that happening quite regularly during COVID. And I've published and posted so many videos, both on
Yes.
YouTube and on TikTok, where people were adamant that they were doing the right thing.
Mhm.
And we'll get into, psychological warfare and all that sort of stuff later.
I do want to add that the purpose of this, in with respect to your question about the Cold War,
Mhm.
so it was technically set up right after World War II. It was in swing within 5 years, and they did cite fears that Russia, China, and Korea, North Korea, that they already had these techniques, and for questioning or interrogating our captured soldiers. And so our government felt that they needed to have the same ability to not only elicit with these techniques that they'd be experimenting on answers from captured enemies in the future, but they also needed to train our soldiers how to evade giving up the answers.
Right.
And I
Okay.
think this has been conveyed in a lot of movies and things like that.
Of course, of course, and a lot of and again, I think the Cold War period, or at least the beginning of the Cold War period, created a lot of these, let's call them programs. And the one that comes to mind as you were talking about that was the Tavistock Institute, which we won't go into at this point, but it was created straight after the Second World War.
Project Paperclip, I need to say, because they're the
Sure.
ones that came over.
Yep.
And that was after World War II had ended. We brought over 12 to 1,500 admitted scientists. A lot of them worked in mind control, torture.
That's right.
And when the war ended, there were hundreds of thousands of babies and toddlers that were left homeless and parentless after the war. They were, in fact, collected, captured, I might argue, and nobody knows exactly what happened to them. But these doctors were able to use whatever little children they had to experiment on. And then Project Paperclip brings them here. And then we get the program. So just to give it context, yes, it's in response to the Cold War, and yet it was created by the same people that we were fighting that created the Cold War.
There you go. And later, we can mention, von Braun and those guys that took up fairly
That's
senior positions in organisations like NASA. But again, we digress. So, do you think? And I know that you mentioned that North Korea, Russia, and China had these programs. So, do you think the fear at the time was justified enough to warrant these kind of programs for the US to go out and say, "Well, we're going to do what you're doing, but we're going to do it better, and we're going to get the upper hand"? Was it justified? The world had just come out of a fairly horrendous world war, basically.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there?
Well, being a civilian and without having military experience, I can still say it stands to reason there are operational advantages to being able to have our soldiers in some theoretical future war at that time to be able to resist answering and giving up secrets. And there's certainly operational advantages, one would imagine, in being able to get the interrogated prisoner to give up their secrets. So the whole purpose of this stated program was initially pegged on enhancing interrogation techniques, and then it began to explode after there. MK Ultra, the only difference was they included every stated objective of Artichoke, and the only language difference was and some other methods of behavioral control. Under that came 150 subprojects that are not declassified. But think about that, 150 different programs. But even that included Artichoke. So we started with the vaccine Twitter post. So we know Artichoke stands with us till today.
Yeah.
MK Ultra continue the same out of Cold Warfare. How could they? MK Ultra scaled it up. How can they do it to a foreign population? Should in the Cold War era, and everyone was worried about nuclear weapons, could we get the information that we needed? So everything was stemming from Cold War fear, but it turns out there were long-term plans that I don't think the people even carrying out the orders knew about.
Sure.
We can mention that today or some other time.
Sure. Great summation. So do you see, and I'll call it paranoia, because, when governments jump into programs like Bluebird, Artichoke, Ultra, we can mention so many. Is it strategic? Is it militarily strategic, or is it simply to drive certain government policy that allows them then to do other things?
I think there was paranoia, but I think it's fair to understand the paranoia when your intelligence assets are letting you know that your biggest enemies have developed all of these chemical, physical, and psychological manipulation techniques. Of course, you would be paranoid, I would assume, stands to reason, that your own troops could succumb to these tactics. And so therefore, in the beginning, it makes sense that the paranoia was, I think, well-founded from at least our view that when we don't have top secret clearance, the war ended, we had enemies, it makes sense. Where it went took a different turn. I just want to make it clear for people who haven't been introduced to this. There are many project names and they all sound different, and that is by design to confuse. But Project Artichoke is about primarily drugs and working on the individual level to get confessions. MK Ultra takes the strategies from Artichoke, but is looking to add to those strategies and control large groups, enemy populations, adversaries. So we're going from small scale, and the Ultra is not only extra secrecy, but it's large scale influence over civilian populations in enemy territory. And we found out later on our own soil, like in my case in the US. So that is important to distinguish. Artichoke was trying to get the individual to do something against their will, even if it's against their own survival. And MK Ultra is taking those, adding techniques, and doing it scaled up.
Would you say that was the predominant change which Bluebird then evolved into Artichoke?
Well, Bluebird was just a first name, and it lasted a year.
Essentially the same program?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
No change. I don't know why they changed it. It sounded like other projects, and so they changed it. There was Bluebird, Blue Book, and so Bluebird. So they changed it a year later in 1952 to Artichoke, which it still continues to be called. They added in 53 MK Ultra because they recognized that not only do we need to do it on the individual, be able to subdue them against their will with all of these different means, but we need to influence. Think of the CIA as the central influence operation for this discussion. They needed to be able to influence en masse. So Bluebird went to Artichoke. Artichoke remains, and Artichoke is a part of MK Ultra, and MK Ultra is for the masses. Does that answer?
Absolutely. And I want to maybe extend that just a little bit further and suggest, and I'd like your thoughts on this, that post the Second World War, these programs were created essentially to gather information, but they've since evolved into shaping behavior. Is that right?
That is right. We have seen the shaping of behavior abroad with what we call color revolutions, overthrowing governments. So we have, and there's, I can't even count the amount of operations that have been used to influence, change the behavior of other civilians in a different location to get them to bend to the will or comply. Everything is about compliance and power. But we've also found out that they've used it for far longer than most people believe in our own countries. And when I say our own, I mean the West.
Of course.
This may have started here, but all over Europe, they all have the same techniques.
Yeah.
Through information sharing, the Five Eyes. So they have also done it to their own populations. You can think of the last 6 years as an example. So it's either to overturn other governments or to accomplish societal divides in other areas. And it's been turned on to the civilian or domestic population in all of Western Europe and here.
This is a great little segue into talking about behaviour, particularly mass conditioning, because for me, when it goes from post-Second World War interrogation techniques to behavioural conditioning, I think that changes the entire picture altogether. Because once you, I guess, influence behaviour, you're clearly beyond interrogation. And as you've rightly pointed out, the last 6 years or the last 5 years certainly prove that. So I think it's probably worthwhile now jumping straight into the specifics of these programs. And I know that you've got a few other programs that I've got to be quite honest, I hadn't heard of until I did my own research. So again, having you speak about this is going to expand the conversation far beyond just this discussion. So, in your opinion, you mentioned Bluebird to Artichoke and then MK Ultra. You've, off air, we've discussed two other programs in particular. I'm not sure if you want to, give our listeners a little bit of an insight into MK Naomi, MK Often. What are your thoughts on those?
Okay, MK Naomi. So we have chemical and drug use for interrogation. Then Naomi brings in biological warfare. So now we're adding biological attacks, gases, aerosolized spray, which could be put over a large population. An example is Agent Orange. At the time, they didn't know when the U.S. did it that it would be killing all of our soldiers 20 years later. But they did drop that. So Naomi added it's the same stated goals of getting people to do what they don't want to do against their will, without their consent, of being manipulated for an outside government to obtain their objectives. Now they've added biological weapons, chemical poisons, aerosolized, and that could also include mouth to mouth, but usually spray, gases being set off in, let's say, subway systems. And biologics can include anything from, they did an experiment in New York in the 50s, putting a viral infection, a vector, into the subway system to see how long it would take to travel across New York. It took 5 minutes.
Wow.
But so they've done that. They use bacteria, fungi, poisons to induce illness, fever, delirium. It's just unsettling people. So
that's MK Naomi.
Naomi brought in, yes, these biological components and the more, I think, gases, other poisons, not just medication.
And so what's MK Often?
I'm not even going to include that because we're going to get bogged down in the weeds. It's similar. One brings in a gas, one brings in bacteria. Naomi covers it. So I don't think often is that important, because what I found by collecting all of these documents is that the names are purposefully changed, decommissioned, recommissioned, rolled into other programs. So it's more important, I think, but I appreciate your question. It's more important to focus on what were the objectives and what happened, because I couldn't keep straight the amount of project names. And there are 150 sub-projects that we don't know the names of which tells me the names aren't as important as the objectives.
Okay, well, can we now perhaps focus on MK Ultra, because I think that's
I would love that.
I guess the most, let's call it the most popular or well-known project that a lot of people say, oh, that's just conspiracy theory, etc. And my understanding is that, as you said, it began in 1953 and apparently, allegedly, it was stopped in 1973. I have very, very big questions about that and doubts. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about MK Ultra, because I also have let's say, a modern day example of how that could possibly work.
Okay. MK Ultra is taking those same principles of getting people to act against their self-interest. A lot of their programs were focused most on psychology. They were trying to create alters, that is splitting a person through trauma-based mind control, which is subjecting usually children to horrific treatment of all kinds, both bodily, Jeffrey Epstein style things.
Sure.
And as a preservation mechanism for the brain, they would create like a different personality that would allow the person to survive. They could train each alter to do different things. So they can, and therefore they created great spies. They created sex slaves. This is all going to sound familiar. People that were capable of gathering as much information as they can, if they were sex slaves, from the person. That alter was programmed to remember. Other people were programmed in MK Ultra to be able to look up and down a document, remember all of it, so there's no pictures taken, there's no machinery necessary that could be caught, and it's in their head. Then they train the alter to go back in hiding, so if they get questioned, the main person, let's say I'm Jen, has no memory of what was installed there. And so these were the Project Paperclip Nazi doctors working with ours that created this method to be able to also communicate to other leaders to set up trafficking for guns, drugs, people. They've always needed a method that didn't depend on devices. So if a person got caught, there was nothing that could be done. So it's mostly psychological and deranged things that they could do, but with also often the use of medication, sedation, drugs that help, particularly during the training phase when they're being trained for individual assignments. Does that help?
Yeah, no, it does. And I was hoping that I could maybe ground this in something a little bit more practical so people can follow. If you've got a minute or so, and you'll be familiar with this, but I'm sure that a lot of people haven't quite connected the dots. So what I've been looking at is, I guess, a pattern involving certain individuals who I'll mention in a moment, who you deem as being creative, visible publicly, and in several cases connected to the same line of inquiry. And, these people literally died within a very tight time frame under the same explanation, which then got me questioning. And I fell into this rabbit hole, a decade, well, not so much a decade ago, but maybe 6 or 7 years ago. So, you've heard of Chester Bennington, and he was the singer of Linkin Park. Now, I won't go into where the name Linkin Park came from, but he was open about his past, being abused as a child. And at the time of his death in 2017, he was working on a documentary called The Silent Children, which was focused on global child exploitation networks, which we know categorically, with the Epstein files being released, etc., that this is a real thing, right? So this is back.
There is no doubt.
There is no doubt. So this was back in 2017. Now, that project also involved Chris Cornell. Thank you. The lead singer of
Soundgarden
and Audio Slave. Yep. He died in May of 2017. 2 months later, right? So he was working on the project. Chris Cornell died by suicide, they say. And 2 months later, Chester Bennington also died. And the documentary that they were working on literally was shelved. It disappeared from view. Now, I'll get to the point of what I'm getting to. Do you have something to say?
There was also a DJ named Avicii.
That's right,
that
Tim
had
Bergling.
a very popular song. And in his video, he actually showed how it's done. The kids being packed into 18-wheelers. He was offed as well.
Yeah, precisely.
In that same time period.
Absolutely the same time period. And he produced work that was directly referencing child trafficking. I can't remember the name of the song. I think it's
a powerful video people can still watch.
Yeah, For a Better Day. It was called For a Better Day. Now, Tim Bergling, his name was Avicii, he died in 2019. I think it was about 6 to 8 months after these two individuals passed away. Now, around that same period, you've heard of the chef Anthony Bourdain.
Oh, yes.
He had been vocal on very, very similar issues and was developing his own material, and he died. Fast forward less than 2 years after that, and you've heard the individual Isaac Kappy.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he had publicly named individuals and claimed knowledge of child trafficking and all that sort of stuff. He died as well, and all these.
There were a lot all at once.
All at once. So within roughly 2 years, you have, 5 extremely well-known people all operating in overlapping spaces, and they're all connected in some way to the same subject matter and all given the same official cause of death. Now, I'll get to where I'm going and what relevance this has to MK Ultra. There was one other one that I've forgotten, which is more relevant to your explanation before I started on this. June the 6th, 1968. People may not remember this, and this was at the height of MK Ultra testing. There was a 24-year-old unknown random. His name was Sirhan Sirhan.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Sirhan.
Bobby Kennedy.
So he assassinated Bobby Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel in California, right? And then he swore black and blue under extremely heavy interrogation that he had absolutely...
He could pass a polygraph.
He passed a polygraph. He had absolutely no memory of it whatsoever. And even to this day, because he is still alive, he swears black and blue that he cannot remember the incident. Right, he's now 82 years old. So how does this link up?
That is such an excellent example of what I was talking about. If you create these sub-personalities, or what they call alters, it gets tucked away and they don't remember it. That's what the whole purpose. So excellent job. Sirhan is perfect example. He did carry out an assassination, and under polygraph and every known means of trying to extract information, he can't give it.
So for me, the question is whether we collectively believe that that's coincidence, or whether it actually points to something a little more structured and nefarious. And, again, this is where MK Ultra comes into it, because if you consider the history of behavioural conditioning, and I've written about this several times, and behavioural conditioning programs such as MK Ultra, then the idea of influencing certain outcomes without leaving any visible traces, I don't believe it's theoretical. I think it's actually well documented. It's just that people haven't actually bothered to delve deep enough. And and when you place what I've just mentioned, that history alongside a sequence like this, where you see the connections, the timing, the outcomes, they align so closely. And it raises a question that I don't think can be dismissed so easily. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think it's clear it's operational.
Correct. Correct.
I don't think anyone can deny. We've seen uh, three named people always that are supposedly assassinating or attempting to assassinate people, and then they get killed right away, and nobody knows how it happened. And then there seems to always be a connection through phone records, through living next door to somebody that's involved with the FBI, the CIA, some type of military intelligence, and mass shooters.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of they always say, oh, they were on SSRIs. Well, there are black warnings. I'm not going to get into whether or not you should or shouldn't take them. That's not my place. But given in the right combinations with other drugs and just priming, putting them into hypnosis. Hypnosis is a huge part of all this. You can get somebody to do something that they normally would never want to do. And if you've noticed, they always get shot and killed, whether it's a mass shooter, someone driving their car into a crowd. They do the deed and then they get killed right away. They get shot on sight. So there's nothing to be said for who it is, unless in like some cases they have a patsy and they go to jail, and it's, very questionable whether or not it's true. I also wanted to point out that when you mentioned Chris Cornell, we're talking about Avicii, Chester Bennington. Chris Cornell did a collaboration with the lead singer from Pearl Jam, and I have just a verse to read to you.
They were absolutely, please
put this out. I brought it. It's called Temple of the Dog, their collaborations, and they made a song called Hunger Strike. And it was also, now this is Chris Cornell again, with Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam. And when I read you the lyrics, so Chris Cornell, it seems to me that it was very well known because there were a lot of people involved in this. So they wrote a song, Hunger Strike, and he says, I don't mind stealing bread from the mouth of decadence, but I can't feed on the powerless when my cup's already overfilled. But it's on the table, the fire is cooking, and they're farming babies while the slaves are working. The blood is on the table and their mouths are choking, but I'm going hungry. So they are trying to bring to attention a lot of things that if you are in the know, you'll be able to read into. And if you're not, you can pretty much, they're talking about farming babies, slaves. There's blood on the table. So we're talking about these ways to control people, which is sacrifice, trauma-based mind control, literally horrifying people into shock to the point where they split off and alter. And I think that this song, which is no coincidence that Chris Cornell was also doing this with Eddie Vedder. So it appears to me a lot of people in the music industry that were in this group were trying to, and you mentioned Isaac Cappy, there have been truth tellers in the entertainment industry. But the first way to deal with it is attack the messenger. Ad hominem attacks against the truth teller. You discredit, you put, let's say, PDF file stuff on a computer. So that person doesn't know, and you and the government or whoever can install it, and then don't listen to him. We just caught them with such and such. So they always try to discredit the truth tellers. And now it's recent enough that we can all remember what was going on in the last 10 years with these assassinations of Bourdain and so forth.
Of course, and if you really look deep enough, they do tell us in plain sight. And you can look at programs like Homeland or Person of Interest. All these CIA government type of
Targeted individuals.
yeah, they can do absolutely anything. But
Anything.
my point about Bennington, Cornell, Bourdain, Cappy, etc., and Avicii. Was more so that they died under pretty, the circumstances were self-harm or
Strange.
strange. Now I'm finding in recent times that, a lot of cardiac arrests are happening, and there are drugs out there that we don't know about that can easily bring on heart attacks without leaving any trace. But again, we'll stick to
that. Goes back to the 50s. So they're doing
of
this
course.
they had the stun guns to create heart attacks without being seen, just imperceptible, something that's fired to someone that causes them to drop dead. So think about 70 years ago, they had these means. So it could be from drones that are targeting through, it could be anything. So yeah, we've been doing this for 70 years that we know of.
Yeah. So let me ask you, because the research that you've done and the research that I've done, and because we do a lot of it, I've come across, when I make queries online, whether it's using AI, whether it's using normal search engines. They say that these are all theories that are labelled as unproven, they're misinformation, conspiracy theories, etc. And, material apparently never existed. Why? I understand why the elites, let's call them, or the ruling class, would go out and do that because they want to keep it hidden. But in your opinion, why are they going to that extent?
I think that the mission has changed. We know that everything has been moving toward a globalist agenda. So rather than fighting individual nation states, even though we're still doing this and it appears so, we all know about United Nations, World Economic Forum, the EU,
WHO,
all of these.
etc.
Yeah, exactly. They're all leaning toward a globalist. So now the mission has changed to domestic, the government's doing it against their own people to get them to comply with, for instance, taking unproven medical interventions that turned out have been shown through a micron electroscope. That is an electroscope that can find things that no other microscope could, an electron microscope. And so they're finding these self-assembling nanotechnologies, whatever it is, and different metals that do go back to the beginning of Artichoke, could help subdue the population, affect their cognition. There's also a global depopulation agenda going on. We discussed it in the last program when Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb. The Club of Rome supported it. All of the major power groups have been talking openly. Even Ted Turner, who bought CNN. Do you remember?
Mm-hmm.
Ted Turner, he was 100% in favor of 500 million people being alive would be the perfect number. So
the Georgia Guidestones had that as well.
Yes, exactly. And so a lot of these drugs and different aerosols, if I don't know if you heard in Europe that there were strange fogs all over the coasts, east and west, which harkens to the gases and all of that. So now the mission is turned domestically to create basically hypnotized, complacent, apathetic, compliant people to achieve what they're trying to get over the finish line, which is a one world apparatus to control the world. So do you see the mission has changed?
Of course.
Even though publicly it hasn't. And it's hard through the tools you mentioned, AI and search bars. But there's military secret archives.org. And I found everything on archives.org and CIA.gov, which leads you to the reading room. So I don't bother with the public stuff. I get on my actual devices the paperwork.
Sure.
What is in the files? And it's the only way you can find out the truth, to the extent that they've declassified it. So there's a lot of truth I don't know, but I can get my hands on the Freedom of Information Act or other FOIA requests, and they're there. And so that's how I learn, to the best that I can, what's going on. But it is a big shift. They're playing out on the global stage still this nation state thing. We're currently at war, as everyone knows, and that's I'm not going to comment on that one way or the other, but it is an outward facing. It is potentially to get resources and other objectives, but in the background, we all can feel, both in the countries we live, countries we may have left, a direct attempt by government apparatus to silence their own people, to censor, to outright lie about everything that's going on the mainstream media. I think it's worth it to say there's a mainstream alternatives, media, and that's getting co-opted. So I think it's important. They all have their purpose, but I think that getting onto archives, and I know most people won't do that, and I don't blame them. They have busy lives. But there is information available, but freedom of speech isn't freedom of reach. So just because something is available, if it is not amplified, if it is not discussed, if it is not reported on the news, they've disclosed it, we don't know to look for it. And I think that's a big problem, and why people are having a hard time understanding the situation we all find ourselves in. It used to be that our governments fought for us against an enemy, and now it appeared in the last 6 years that anybody that tried to protest against certain narratives, there were these men in black ready to gas them and, attack them. And I saw horrible things that went on in other countries and in places here. So that's really an exercise in not only behavioral control, fear, panic, but also at the same time, chemical agents or medications used to subdue. So do you see how the mission has changed slightly?
Well, thank you for that. I want to circle back to MK Ultra in particular, because that has implications on what we've witnessed the last 5 or 6 years. Despite the fact that they keep on saying to us that the program existed from 53 to 73 and nothing happened ever since, I personally I don't buy that.
No.
But why MK Ultra out of all the other ones? Why is that the one that has gained so much traction publicly? Because when you mention MK Ultra to say a normie, for example, they would have heard of it, but they probably don't know much about it. The fact that they've heard of it says to me that there's it's
coming out.
It's coming out. So why MK Ultra?
Artichoke relied specifically, and other programs relied on chemical, biological weapons, but MK Ultra can work. The main way they do it through the masses is hypnosis, through technology on our TV, using bass notes in the background music. They're flashing messages that our eye can't see, the refresh rate. They're also LED screens mess with our neurology. So MK Ultra is a really useful thing to not have to go door to door and use chemicals, but through constant fear. People can't make decisions. I can't. When you're in a state of panic, you fight or flight or freeze. And so people are left utterly unable to make a decision. And so at scale, you get a lot of bang for your buck by just scaring them. The government studied how to get this fear into people, and they boiled it down to several techniques. because they say that anxiety, deliberately inducing anxiety, manipulates behavior, fear, and exploiting phobias render a person unable to make a decision. And here's how they do it. They use disorientation, such as moving things, distorted spaces, soundproof areas. That's not so often. Environmental effects, studying the impacts of heat, cold, dampness, dryness, saturated or dry air on psychological states. So if we think about right now, there's power outages, heat waves, power outages or not enough fuel, it's cold. This they studied. Then they use sound, and that is vibration, monotonous sounds, ultra high frequencies, ultrasonics, repeated words. Safe and effective, build back better, build back better.
Oh,
These
goodness.
mantras that are over and over again, they tend to have a semi-hypnotic effect because repeated often enough, you stop reacting to them and become complacent. Repeated words, whispering, and other auditory stimuli on the humans. And that's what I was saying about movies and music have frequencies and tones that we can't specifically hear that are directly meant to interact with our physiology, which means how our body works. And so we have seen in concerts, there are people that swear they went to Taylor Swift concerts and they couldn't remember anything. There was a concert several years ago. It turned into a bloodbath. People got stampeded. That some rapper, the Kardashians were there, and a bunch of people, they opened, it was like ritualistic. There was a mouth they had to climb through.
Yeah,
and
who
then
was that?
I don't remember all these rappers' names because they've got numbers. And but do you
no, it wasn't
remember?
Juice World. No, it wasn't Juice World. It was. Well, I'll think of it. Sorry to interrupt you. I'll think of it.
Well, no, I mean, I would like to figure it out, but it got caught on camera that suddenly rows of people just started to fall like onto each other. And then in another phase, everybody inexplicably rushed and crushed to the stage, and lots of people got killed. If you can pull up the numbers on that, that would be great. But that is an example of mind control. They also use flashing lights and things like that.
Travis Scott.
Along with sound. Travis Scott,
I
yes.
was kind of
was
close. It
dating
was
Kylie Jenner at the time.
That's right. Astro World, not Juice World. Juice World was a young man.
Tell me what you remember about that, because that's pretty significant.
Well, I think this was back in 2021. There was obviously, as you said, a big skull head, like a skull
and a mouth.
And a mouth. But when fans were leaving the concert or post the concert, that they felt that they were in some sort of ritual. It was very chaotic, very utopian, and that obviously that concert resulted in the fatal crowd crush during that festival, during the Astroworld Festival. So, yeah, but I can give you so many examples of.
Can you give me one that you just off the top of your head that you could think of? It'd be interesting.
Well, when I was in the UK, I was speaking to a young man, a young barista, and I'd got to know him over a few months, and he had told me that he had been to a Florence and the Machine, I think they're called.
Florence and the Machine.
Florence and the Machine concert, and I had done a bit of research on some of their concerts, and like Astro World, they became very ritualistic, so very energy harvesting concerts. And I didn't say this to him because I would have come across as a bit of a nut job, but I said, "Oh, tell me about the concert." They're a great band, and he actually then proceeded to tell me that he had this feeling that he shouldn't be there, that it was this unknowing feeling that something was happening to his body.
Intuition?
Something physically was happening to his body. So he ended up leaving the concert halfway through. And sure enough, when you dive deep into Florence and the Machine, you know that they're part of the system, the music industry system. And again, I was going to mention the frequencies.
That's what this is a part of. These ultra low low or ultra high
Well,
frequencies.
they changed. I think it was Rockefeller time. They changed it from 432 hertz to 440 hertz because
Yes.
440 hertz was a much more heavier, energetic frequency to the human body.
On the cellular level, it changes and it can be studied in real time that the frequencies of at 440 create a cellular anomalies or dysfunction. So if you were to look under a microscope, what you would normally think of as nice round circles, let's just say, they're all misshapen, some are just stagnant and dead, and that's what they've done to our music. So that's an excellent example.
Yeah.
Interesting that your barista that you're referring to actually felt it.
He was a young man. He was a young man.
Out.
He was a 19-year-old, 20-year-old.
Most people don't even notice it. So this
No,
is
that's
pretty
right.
exceptional that he was so in tune with his own body. He understood get out. But your example speaks to the point or highlights or even magnifies like what I am hearing about these other people. I don't know Florence and the Machine's music, but or Travis Scott, but it's the same type of techniques. I will say with Travis Scott, when they went through the mouth, it's reminiscent of, Molech eating the children.
That's
and
right.
It's no accident on some atavistic or inborn ancestral memory. They all have a ritualistic. I'm just glad he got out.
Well, absolutely. And look, we can talk about the music industry perhaps on another podcast. I've written on several occasions, I've written about the music industry and how they, let's say for the argument of this discussion, they use MK Ultra type performances to draw people in mentally. So, but we won't go there. We're digressing.
Create like a hypnotic effect. But I can say outside of music, just that the significance is getting them into this almost semi-hypnotic state to suggest. I want to bring up something that's a little off the wall that I found.
Of course.
But it actually, everyone today can get it. It's research on how nutritional deprivation impacts mental and emotional states, potentially as a method of psychological manipulation.
Of course.
Deficiencies were exploring the psychological physical effects by removing essential dietary food elements, sugar, starch, calcium, vitamins, protein from an individual's diet. They did this in a jail. They used canned food produced by the people doing the experiments. So they extract all of the necessary minerals and vitamins from the diet. And they saw right then and there the immediate effects of psychological breakdown in a short period of time. And so when we ponder our food supply and GMOs and spraying from the skies, we can see in real time to make this real to our listeners. We're not talking about some antiquated project that may have started from the Cold War, but we can see, whether you agree what they mean or not, these events taking place right now. And a lot of people are lamenting the fact that they can't get real food seeds that aren't genetically modified.
That's right.
And then you've got issues with irrigation, the water falling from the sky with metals, that food. So what was done to those prisoners is now at scale globally to the people. And it does, from the nutritional standpoint, get people into states of extreme agitation. So that would be whipping people up into a state of riots. It could also extreme depression, suicides, or psychosis, killing other people when the depression gets bad enough. So we can see events in our culture that are criminal taking place. But I didn't realize that the food nutrition was such a key component and how that directly relates. What do you say about that?
Again, I've written about food, not necessarily extraction of certain ingredients, but food manipulation, be it GMO, etc. And it's particularly the essay that I wrote and I published on Substack was more around the US and Australia, because they're two countries that I found a pattern in their their food products, their supermarket products, etc., which is why there's a large case of dis-ease that happens in those countries. Obviously, US has got a much bigger population, so the numbers are going to be greater. But I am very certain that that's intentionally done
Yes.
to make people submissive to government policies or government actions that will ultimately control the populations. Now, that may come across as a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory.
Well, I'm
but it's
getting it from the
proven.
document, so
Yeah.
your article lines up. Can you tell everyone what the article's name was? Because you are 369 Luminary
That's right.
on Substack. Well, do you remember the name of that article? Because your articles are incredible, and I post them on Substack and share them everywhere.
Yeah, I've written over 80.
I'm sorry, I'm forcing you into a shameless plug, but
not at all.
I think it's an important
absolutely.
baseline.
I focused predominantly on the markets of the US and Australia in particular because I found the correlations between their food additives to be quite consistent. And the article that people can refer to, and we'll put the link in the
Yes.
in the summary notes, but it's a slow poison on US and Australian plates. So I talk about regulations and how the US and Australian food system differs markedly from, say, the European food system.
Or even Canada.
Or even Canada. There are a lot of additives that are outright banned in those countries. But anyway, we digress. Thank you for.
Okay. I just want to let you know that I have friends in Canada and we whipped out our boxes of cereal and the amount of ingredients in mine versus theirs.
Well, look,
so many different projects. So we know this is true in real time because they're showing me. So for people who think that this is tinfoil hat, it can be absolutely confirmed. It's on the boxes of the products.
Well,
just to let you know.
Yeah, I encourage people to walk into their local supermarket and maybe pick up a tub of ice cream. It's not called ice cream anymore. It's called ice confection, number one, because that's how they get away with not actually making it with cream. Also to go and try and find a real butter. Butter is very simple, 2 ingredients. You go and find a butter in your local supermarket, or what's deemed or what's promoted as butter is not. It has a list of 20 or 30 ingredients that are absolutely.
These are these poisons that are also put into pharmaceuticals that began from artichoke. But you see when you're trying to manipulate at mass scale how it kind of slides over into MK Ultra, behavioral control. Go ahead.
Absolutely. No. And this is a great segue into ethics. And I want to talk about ethics ever so briefly, just being also conscious of time. With all your research into the different programs and the mind-controlled human behavior, etc., where do you personally draw the ethical line with these kinds of programs? And I think COVID's a very recent and very apt example.
Why don't you tell the example and I'll give you my...
Well, the example that I have written about again, and we'll put the link in the summary notes, is Tuskegee. It's the study...
Tuskegee.
Oh,
Tuskegee.
I apologise.
Tuskegee. No problem.
Tuskegee.
Yep. Why don't you tell us about it? It's an incredible case.
I'll be very quick. It was a syphilis study, and when you start looking at patterns, as I did, not isolated events but patterns, you begin to notice that certain individuals, often vocal, often questioning, often pushing against dominant narratives, they tend to meet sort of similar ends. So the Tuskegee Syphilis Study ran for 40 years in the US, where hundreds of African American men were told that they were receiving medical care when in reality...
In prisons, it started.
It started in prisons. That's right. Where, they were receiving medical care, but in reality, they were being injected with syphilis. Now, even after a cure became widely available, it just wasn't given to them. But the study continued, and it was only exposed decades later. So, coming, circling back to the purpose of this discussion, when we talk about secrecy, when we talk about justification, about the idea that certain lines won't be crossed, history clearly shows us that those lines have already been crossed. So
Absolutely.
the question for me is, under what conditions does that happen again?
Well, you were asking me about where does the ethical line get drawn, and I think an issue of consent, a basic right is
Brilliant.
to know if you want to volunteer for a study, and people do, they volunteer for clinical studies, trials when they've run out. They don't know what it's going to do to them, but they want it. It's their last chance for cancer treatments or other chronic issues. That is them knowing that the outcome could be great or it could be terrible, and they are choosing. So consent is one of the biggest issues. Children off the table, and I think most non-psychopathic humans would agree that's off limits. But the way it works, all of it's lack of consent. Like you just said, they will set parameters in public in their studies of what they're doing, and it is not tethered to any truth. Just like when they tell you that medications are safe and effective, and you find out 3 years after you've taken a certain med that they never actually studied it.
Yeah.
Surprise.
Yeah.
But you were told it. You didn't read anything. You kept hearing the message parroted to you. So I think that the lying, to your point, hasn't stopped. In theory, I mean, we should be told, and the government is supposedly here to protect us, but they are doing all of these things without consent.
Mm.
What do you think the
No,
ethical
no.
boundaries are?
Yeah, look, I agree. For me, once informed consent disappears, I think the line's clearly been crossed. And I don't care what justification governments use
I agree.
to justify it. I just think that individual rights have been abused, and this
Taken
is
away.
taken away. And this is why, we've seen historically things that have happened. And obviously, COVID for me is a very, very apt example of this because, the research that you and I have done, we clearly see that as being one big experiment to override population, and they clearly did it because, again, the masses weren't aware of what was going on. If you weren't awake at that time, then you would. And again, I don't.
Of course, you would take it if you didn't know
Of
better.
course, of course, of
And
course.
how would they know better if their doctor's telling them, the news is telling them, all their friends are getting it?
That's right.
My heart goes out to them. I
Yeah,
only knew it because I was a nurse and I was following the medical
yeah,
aspect, and I knew that there was a plan, a depopulation plan. I
yeah.
read the book in the 90s in Murder by Injection. So I had it, but I have half of my family took it. So I have complete
Same.
compassion for them, but
Yeah.
it has come out that they didn't do the testing and that it is very cytotoxic, meaning it destroys cells, neurotoxic, meaning it goes right to your brain, the metals. And we have seen an explosion of dementia
Mm,
under the people call it Alzheimer's. That's one form of dementia in the 35 to 55-year-old population, which is unheard of.
yeah.
So you have people who have died, estimated 20 million have died,
Mm,
uh, heart attacks, strokes, blood clots, a lot of miscarriages, infertility, problems with the children afterwards. It's not for everybody. This is just what we globally can see is happen to our population based on the ability to reproduce. It
mm,
has gone way down. There are a lot of factors in that, but we were all subjected to the initial program and then the loss that a lot of us dealt with, losing family members,
mm,
not maybe to death, and sometimes because they've just checked out. And when I say that, you look in their eyes, they're still making good money, they're going to work, but people I knew when I'm in my 50s seem like they're sort of out to lunch in my own family. So I'm not projecting onto the world stage, but that makes sense because the critical thinking is gone. And if you don't have critical thinking, you will absolutely go along with these agendas that they have on the domestic population now. And I think most people listening to this, if they really sit for a moment with it, that they'll know people and they can, and there's no blame. Again, how could anyone have known? We look to the people to protect us, but what they did show us is they do not have our best interest at heart in all cases. Another thing that most people, at least in the United States, I'm not sure what's going on outside of it, we have these massive cell towers for
5G?
5G,
Yes,
6G coming,
Wow.
and they're putting it inside of housing developments.
Oh,
And
gosh.
they've got years and years of studies that show proximity to these towers causes massive cancers, depending on what frequencies they send out, behavioral changes, sleep changes. And it's quite concerning. I was in the car the other day and I can't believe how many of them are in these different communities or residential,
Wow.
suburban, these little communities everywhere.
Sure,
And
sure.
it's already known that they're killing people. So for what it's worth, I want to mention those towers.
So, okay, so let me ask you a question without notice. World War II, Cold War, we have these programs, and we can comfortably say that these programs still exist, whether governments denied that or not. Do you now think these programs have morphed into things like frequency modulation? And, we were talking about concepts of, astro world. We were talking about 440 hertz, etc. Do you think that this is where we're at? And 5G is obviously an example as well.
It's one component, but I think the main deal now is back to consent is open warfare on the people, but it's invisible. So it is without consent, and we don't realize that our bodies, our health, have a war being waged on it.
Of course.
And we can't see it. So this theory of, silent weapons for quiet wars, we don't see it. We mentioned this in our Antarctica podcast.
We did.
The frequencies, the technology that is being used that we can't see. And how do you fight something you're not aware of? That's why we're here, to try to make people aware.
Of course, which again brings me into a question that I'd like to ask you is that, firstly, how much of the truth is still actually available? And I know you've mentioned archive.org, etc., versus what's still hidden. That's part A to my question. And part B, which is relevant, is that for anyone listening, where would you point them to start their own research?
We only have access. We'll leave the links directly.
Of course.
And all you have to type in is MK Ultra in the search bar. Once you get onto it, this is not difficult. And it gives you options: video, audio. Do you want text? You can do anything. I've watched interviews from people that are victims of this on the archives. So what we can, they're not telling us. Whatever is in the archives, that's it. It's why we've been spending so much time pointing out what this looks like. Is you can see it happening. It's silent weapons, but you can see the casualties, the victims of it. That is what we know. So it's by direct observation, because they're not declassifying clearly what they don't want us to know, because it is without consent.
Perfect. Thank you. So, as you said, we'll leave quite a number of links in the summary notes. But in the interest of time, after everything that we've discussed, as an independent researcher and all the work that you've done, what stands out to you the most when we talk about BLUEBIRD to ARTICHOKE to MK Ultra and various other programs that exist as well?
I think that when I got onto the archive, and I always am on archives, I was shocked, because as awake as I've been, I hate that term anymore, but 15, 20 years and doing research, I still assumed that the weapons that were being used were for enemies. I think I was shocked to find out that from the very inception, these programs were always going to be used, even if it was in the testing phase. on unsuspecting, unwitting populations. And now, 70 years forward, it's out in the open. We've all been faced with mandatory interventions. Young mothers are being faced with being forced to vaccinate. When I graduated, it was 10. Now it's 72 by the time they hit 18. You can see, and there's an explosion of kids in high school that are now considered neurodivergent. I just raised them out of high school, and getting diagnosed at 17 and 18 suddenly with autism. And they didn't show any signs. So I think the biggest surprise was that they're really targeting us, the citizens that pay the taxes and pay the money to help create the weapons that are actually being deployed at us.
Sure.
I still wanted to believe that there was some line that wouldn't be crossed, and I don't see that.
Yeah,
I could be wrong, but
no,
what are you most surprised by?
Look, I'm surprised by the level of, I'll call it propaganda, that's been put out by governments around the world, saying that certain programs, etc., have been shelved and aren't being used. I think that's a bunch of BS, if you ask me, which is why I'm constantly on the front foot and doing, as much research as I do to educate myself, not to go out and, for the better use of a term, Bible bash this to others. But this is the reason I write what I write and how much I write, and also,
good.
And also this
Your
podcast
writing is
as well.
amazing.
Thank you, Jen. But that's essentially, I'm always looking at, the why, COVID, the why. Now there was apparently an outbreak of not encephalitis, but there was some sort of brain disease that had come out, and then people just stood up and said, "No, this is a load of BS." And you tried this with COVID, and sure enough, it went away.
They tried to make a monkeypox thing,
the
and that didn't work.
Monkeypox, all that sort of stuff. So hopefully, look, my main take out of this is that I hope people are starting to realise that governments aren't there to help them, at least the modern day governments. They stand up and they ask why these things are happening. Why do I have to do this? And a mandate isn't necessarily a law.
It's not legal. It's just a mandate.
It's just a mandate. That's exactly right.
But the compliance, for those who have complied, gave the leaders that take the orders from the rulers that people will go along with it.
That's right.
But on the other hand, there's a lot of people that even got duped that are now learning from either direct experience with their body, their family members, or loved ones that will not be so quick to comply.
Sure.
The issue is what we've discussed today, which are these silent weapons.
Yeah.
But the Jeffrey Epstein files confirm a lot of what we've talked about, and those were released by the government. So before anyone says this is all tinfoil hat, a lot of information regarding these kinds of programs, particularly mind control, have all been released. So you can see a lot, and it's now fact. So we don't have to wonder if this is still going on. And last point I'd like to make on that is the military has learned to outsource to private industry what they're doing, which gives plausible deniability. So they have an idea, and then they hire, let's say, an aerospace company, let's say, any military industrial building company, and they produce
Boeing,
the chemicals,
Raytheon,
the poisons, the planes to dispel aerosols. So that is another main tactic. So I really hope that people look around them, not what the rulers are saying, but what are you observing?
Well, I think we've reached the end of what's to me has been a very, very insightful conversation, Jen, and I really appreciate the depth and clarity that you've brought to this discussion. Before we do wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think I want to leave our listeners with the fact that they need to read your articles, because you write about the things that are happening and you are calling out what those things are. And as far as you can research, and you are an excellent researcher, who's responsible? And you are warning people, you are exposing things. And so I think these conversations like you have with Phoenician Hunter are wonderful, but they're based on the research he does and you do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's so much value in reading and learning. And you're on Substack. Phoenician Hunter's on Substack.
That's
I'm
right.
on Substack.
That's right.
And I would recommend a lot of people to visit your articles, because you hit a lot of the subjects that we brought up tangentially, and you focus on them. And I would steer them there, and then we will leave links to where I got my information, so you can see the exact same thing that we spoke about, and it doesn't have to be a wondering game.
Absolutely.
Where we leave is where you'll find the exact information we brought up today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for the depth that you've brought to this conversation, Jen. I've got to say, your attention to detail and commitment to the archival record really has shaped what we've just discussed in a very, very meaningful way. And I genuinely appreciate your openness and the clarity with which you navigated, in my opinion, some very, very complex ground. So to our listeners, if this discussion made you think differently, always help spread the light. Share it, discuss it, pay attention to the places where information feels missing or deliberately smoothed over. Again, I encourage you to follow Jen on Substack, and we'll put all the links in the summary notes. Until next time, always notice the gaps in what you're told and consider what those gaps might mean. As always, stay curious, stay critical, and stay aware. You've been listening to the Luminary Room. This is Nico and special guest Jen V, signing off.